Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more captivating stories like the one you're about to hear. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens to Margaret in this tale of betrayal and redemption. Margaret Thompson stared at her phone, the screen's pale glow illuminating her face in the dimly lit living room of her modest Connecticut home. The clock on the wall ticked past 11:30 p.m. Her birthday was almost over, and once again her phone remained silent. No calls, no messages from her son Brian or his wife Sarah, not even a generic Facebook post. Nothing. She set the phone down with a sigh that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than her lungs. 64 years old today, and apparently still invisible. "I suppose Patricia had another emergency," Margaret muttered to herself, the words hanging in the empty room like unwelcome guests. She'd heard it all before. Patricia's migraines, Patricia's blood pressure, Patricia's anxiety attacks, all conveniently timed to coincide with any event centered around Margaret. Her fingers traced the edge of the envelope on her coffee table. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, bearing the letterhead of Thornton and Wexler, attorneys at law. Inside was the news that had left her momentarily breathless. Her spinster Aunt Helen had passed away, leaving Margaret the sole beneficiary of her estate, a staggering $7.3 million. Margaret hadn't told Brian yet. At first, it was because she needed time to process the information herself. Then, as the days passed and her birthday approached, a rebellious thought had taken root. Why tell them at all? They barely remembered she existed unless they needed something. Her laptop was open to a real estate listing she'd been eyeing for days, a waterfront villa on Long Island Sound, priced at $3.2 million. The Victorian-style home featured large windows that seemed to capture the ocean itself, a wraparound porch where she could imagine sipping morning coffee while watching the sunrise, and enough bedrooms for guests, should she ever choose to have any. Margaret's finger hovered over the contact agent button. She thought of how Brian and Sarah had insisted on joint bank accounts to help her manage her finances after Harold died 3 years ago, how they'd set up alerts on her credit cards for her protection, how they scrutinized every purchase she made as if she were a child unable to distinguish needs from wants. With a sudden defiance that surprised even herself, Margaret clicked the button. "Let's see if they notice me now," she whispered, feeling both terrified and liberated by her rebellion. 2 weeks later, Margaret sat across from Elaine Forrester, a sharp-dressed realtor with a no-nonsense attitude that Margaret had immediately appreciated. "The owners have accepted your offer, Mrs. Thompson," Elaine said, sliding the paperwork across the polished desk. "The property will be yours as soon as we close. I must say, it's refreshing to work with someone who knows exactly what they want." Margaret felt a flutter of excitement as she signed her name on the documents. "I've spent my whole life knowing what everyone else wanted, Elaine. It's about time I figured out what I want." The transaction was deliberately structured to bypass the accounts Brian monitored. Margaret had opened a new private account at a different bank using her maiden name for the inheritance funds, consulted with her own financial advisor, and arranged for the property purchase to be completed with minimal paper trail. As she drove home from the realtor's office, Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Brian's name flashed on the screen. "Mom, did you make a large withdrawal from your savings account yesterday?" His voice carried that familiar tone, concerned on the surface, controlling underneath. Margaret felt her heart race but kept her voice steady. "Hello to you too, Brian. Yes, I bought a new washing machine. The old one flooded the laundry room last week." "A washing machine for $5,000? The skepticism in his voice was unmistakable. "It's a good one," she replied simply. "How's Patricia doing? Better, I hope." The diversion worked as Brian launched into a detailed account of his mother-in-law's latest health crisis, something about inflammation and specialists. Margaret made appropriate sympathetic noises while mentally picturing the keys to her new home. What Brian didn't know was that Margaret had been quietly researching Patricia Wells for the past month. The health emergencies had always seemed suspiciously timed, and Patricia's background stories contained inconsistencies that had increasingly bothered Margaret. Using some of her newfound wealth, Margaret had hired Thomas Reeves, a private investigator recommended by her new financial advisor. Their first meeting had been yesterday, and he'd promised preliminary findings within a week. As she ended the call with Brian, her inbox pinged with an email from Thomas. It had come sooner than expected. The subject line read simply, "Urgent, Patricia Wells information." The following morning, Margaret sat in Thomas Reeves's office, her hands clutching a manila folder that contained information that had kept her awake all night. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas, a former police detective with kind eyes that contrasted with his imposing build, nodded solemnly. "I've triple-checked everything, Mrs. Thompson. Patricia Wells doesn't exist, at least not the one you know. The woman calling herself Patricia Wells is actually Patricia Warren, with a criminal record in Florida and North Carolina for fraud and elder financial abuse." Margaret stared at the photographs spread before her, mugshots of a younger Patricia, newspaper clippings detailing confident schemes targeting wealthy widows and widowers, court records of multiple identity thefts. "But she's been in our lives for over 5 years, Margaret said, struggling to reconcile the familiar face of her daughter-in-law's mother with the criminal described in the documents. "That's how these long cons work," Thomas explained gently. "They establish themselves in the community, build trust over time. It's patient predation." Margaret's fingers trembled as she turned to the next page. "And Sarah, my daughter-in-law." Thomas's expression grew even more grave. "Sarah Warren, Patricia's daughter and, I'm sorry to say, accomplice. They've worked together before. Based on my investigation, Sarah deliberately targeted your son at that financial planning conference in Boston 6 years ago." The room seemed to tilt as Margaret absorbed this information. The conference where Brian had met Sarah, his serendipitous meeting with the woman who would become his wife, had been a setup, a calculated move in a long game to access the Thompson family's assets. "There's more," Thomas continued, his voice gentle but firm. "We've found evidence of identity theft. Someone has been using your social security number and Harold's posthumous identity to open credit lines. Approximately $180,000 has been siphoned from your family through forged signatures and fraudulent accounts over the past 3 years." Margaret thought of the joint accounts Brian had insisted on managing, the credit alerts that always went to his phone first, the subtle way he'd taken control of her finances after Harold's death. Had her son been complicit, or was he another victim? "Brian," she whispered, "does he know?" Thomas shook his head. "That's unclear at this point. He could be an unwitting participant, manipulated by Sarah and Patricia. Or he could be part of it," Margaret finished, the possibility feeling like a physical blow. "I recommend we take this information to the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit," Thomas said. "Detective Andrea Morris specializes in cases like this. She can help determine your son's involvement and build a case against Patricia and Sarah." Margaret nodded slowly, her shock giving way to a steely resolve. "Set up the meeting. I want this stopped. Not just for me, but for anyone else they might target in the future." As she drove home, the weight of betrayal pressed against her chest. But beneath the pain was something else, a growing sense of clarity. For years, she'd been made to feel incompetent, forgetful, less than. Now she understood why. They needed her to doubt herself, to accept their control. The waterfront villa she'd purchased now represented more than just a rebellious splurge. It was her declaration of independence. Detective Andrea Morris's office at the Connecticut State Police Headquarters was functional rather than comfortable. But Margaret found the environment reassuring. This wasn't a place for pretense. "We've been building a case file based on the information Mr. Reeves provided," Detective Morris explained, her efficient manner matched by her crisp appearance. The patterns match known fraud schemes Patricia Warren has used before. What's different this time is the long-term nature of the con and the involvement of your daughter-in-law. Margaret nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And my son. Have you determined if Brian is involved? Andrea's expression softened slightly. Based on our preliminary investigation, it appears your son is another victim, Mrs. Thompson. The financial manipulation shows a pattern consistent with isolation tactics, separating you from your son by creating constant crises with Patricia, while Sarah works to control his perception of your capabilities. Relief flooded through Margaret, followed immediately by concern for Brian. He'll be devastated. He truly loves Sarah. Unfortunately, that's what makes him a valuable target, Andrea said. We'll need your help to document the evidence without tipping them off. Are you prepared for that? It won't be easy. Margaret thought of her new home waiting for her, the keys still in the envelope from the realtor. She thought of her forgotten birthdays, the dismissed suggestions, the subtle gaslighting that had made her question her own judgment. I'm prepared, she said firmly. What do you need me to do? For the next 2 weeks, Margaret lived a double life. To Brian, Sarah, and Patricia, she was the same slightly confused widow who needed their guidance. She allowed Sarah to help with her banking, noticing now how Sarah's eyes lingered on account numbers and balances. She listened to Patricia's dramatic health stories, observing the calculated way Patricia watched for reactions. All the while, Margaret documented everything. Special software installed by the Financial Crimes Unit recorded phone conversations. Hidden cameras captured Sarah searching through Margaret's home office when she thought Margaret was napping. A forensic accountant traced the tangled web of fraudulent accounts opened in Margaret's name. The most difficult part was maintaining the pretense during Sunday dinner at Brian and Sarah's home. Patricia was there, as always, dominating the conversation with tales of her latest medical consultations. The specialist says it's quite rare, my condition, Patricia was saying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The treatments are experimental, of course. Such a burden on poor Sarah and Brian. Margaret caught the meaningful glance between Patricia and Sarah, a silent communication that she would have missed before, but now recognized as the setup for another financial emergency. That sounds serious, Margaret said, playing her role. What did you say the condition was called again? A flicker of annoyance crossed Patricia's face before she smoothed it into a pained smile. It's very complicated, Margaret. I wouldn't expect you to understand the medical terminology. Try me, Margaret said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The momentary panic in Patricia's expression was almost imperceptible, but Margaret saw it clearly now that she knew what to look for. Mom, you should see the new car Dad and I are thinking about getting you, Brian interjected, changing the subject in what Margaret now recognized as a practiced maneuver. Your current one is getting so old, and your car insurance would be lower with something newer, Sarah added smoothly. We found one that would be perfect. We could go tomorrow to sign the paperwork. Margaret nodded agreeably, knowing that the perfect car would come with financing paperwork that would give them access to even more of her funds or credit. That sounds lovely, she said, but let's wait until after next weekend. I have a small surprise I've been meaning to share with all of you. The following Saturday, Margaret stood on the wraparound porch of her new villa, the Long Island Sound stretching before her like a promise. The morning sun cast a golden glow across the water, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility. Behind her, a small team from the Financial Crimes Unit was setting up discreet recording equipment throughout the house. Detective Morris checked the microphone clipped to the inside of Margaret's cardigan. Remember, we need clear admissions, Andrea reminded her. Get them talking about the accounts, the credit lines, especially the ones in Harold's name. Once they're here, act surprised and confused by the house, like you don't remember buying it. That should make them comfortable enough to reveal more. Margaret nodded, her nervousness tempered by determination. I've been playing confused for their benefit for years now. I think I can manage one more performance. At precisely noon, a car pulled into the circular driveway. Margaret watched as Brian, Sarah, and Patricia emerged, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. "Mom?" Brian called out as he approached the porch. "What is this place? The address you sent said it was urgent." Margaret put on her best bewildered expression. "Brian, thank goodness you're here. I woke up in this strange house and I don't know how I got here. There are papers with my signature, but I don't remember buying a house." The looks exchanged between Sarah and Patricia spoke volumes, a mixture of alarm and calculation that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Let's go inside and figure this out," Sarah said, taking Margaret's arm with a solicitousness that now felt predatory. In the expansive living room, with its panoramic views of the Sound, Margaret continued her act, showing them the closing documents while appearing increasingly distressed. "It says I paid over $3 million, she said, her voice trembling convincingly. "But that's impossible. I don't have that kind of money." Patricia sat down beside her, patting her hand in a gesture that once might have seemed comforting, but now felt intrusive. "Margaret, dear, this is very concerning. I think we need to consider that you might be experiencing some cognitive issues. My doctor friend specializes in early-onset dementia. We should get you evaluated." $3 million, Sarah repeated, her eyes scanning the paperwork with naked interest. "Where would that money even come from?" Brian looked genuinely worried. "Mom, why wouldn't you tell us about this? We're supposed to make these decisions together." Margaret allowed tears to well in her eyes. "I don't remember, Brian. That's what scares me. Just like I don't remember authorizing those credit cards Sarah said I opened." A sudden stillness fell over the room. Sarah's expression froze, and Patricia's hand stopped its patting motion. "What credit cards?" Brian asked, looking confused. "The ones Sarah told me about last month," Margaret said, her voice small and frightened. "The ones in my name and Harold's name. She said I must have forgotten opening them." Brian turned to his wife. "Sarah, what credit cards?" The moment hung suspended as Sarah's mind visibly raced for an explanation. Patricia jumped in smoothly. "Brian, dear, this is exactly why we've been concerned. Margaret's memory has been so unreliable. Remember how she forgot to pay her property taxes last year?" "But I didn't forget," Margaret said, dropping the confused act as she pulled out a folder from beside the sofa. "I have the receipt right here. Sarah told you I forgot, but she actually took the check I wrote and used it to open an account in my name at First Federal. Just like she used Harold's social security number to open 3 credit cards after he died." The color drained from Sarah's face. Patricia stood abruptly. "Margaret, you're confused. Brian, we should get her to a doctor immediately." "I'm not confused, Patricia. Or should I call you by your real name, Patricia Warren?" Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "I know exactly who you are and what you've been doing. I know about your frauds in Florida and North Carolina. I know how you and Sarah targeted elderly individuals for their money, and I know you targeted my son to get to me." Brian looked stunned, his gaze darting between his mother, his wife, and his mother-in-law. "What is she talking about?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Don't listen to her," Sarah said quickly, reaching for his hand. "She needs help, medical help." "The only help needed here is legal help," said Detective Morris, stepping into the room from where she'd been waiting. She displayed her badge. "Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit. We have extensive documentation of fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. Sarah and Patricia Warren, you're both under arrest." As uniformed officers entered and read the women their rights, Brian sank onto the sofa, his world visibly crumbling around him. Margaret sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I'm so sorry, Brian. I didn't know how to tell you. I needed to make sure you weren't involved." You thought I might be part of this?" he asked, hurt evident in his voice. "For a little while," she admitted. You were so insistent on controlling my finances, but now I understand they were manipulating you too." As they watched Patricia and Sarah being led away in handcuffs, Brian turned to his mother with tears in his eyes. "I've been a fool, haven't I? All those years believing their lies about you, about Patricia's health. I let them come between us." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We both made mistakes, but we have a chance to start over now." 6 months later, Margaret stood on the same porch, watching the winter waves crash against the shore. The prosecution of Patricia and Sarah Warren was proceeding smoothly, with multiple victims from other states coming forward after news of their arrest broke. Brian had filed for divorce and was slowly rebuilding his life and his relationship with his mother. "Coffee's ready," called a warm voice from inside. Margaret smiled as Thomas Reeves joined her on the porch, handing her a steaming mug. What had begun as a professional relationship had gradually evolved into friendship, and then, unexpectedly, into something more. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. "I was just thinking about how different this year has been," she replied. "Last birthday, I sat alone in my old house, feeling forgotten and invisible. I never could have imagined standing here now." Thomas's eyes crinkled as he smiled. "You weren't invisible, Margaret. You just needed to be seen by the right people." The sound of a car in the driveway drew their attention. Brian emerged, carrying a gift-wrapped package. "He's early," Margaret said, checking her watch. "The party's not for another 2 hours." "He probably wanted some time with you first," Thomas suggested. "I'll head inside and help with the preparations." As Brian approached, Margaret noticed how much younger he looked now, free from the constant strain of Sarah and Patricia's manipulation. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, embracing her warmly. "I wanted to give you this before everyone else arrives." Margaret unwrapped the package to find a beautifully framed photograph of herself and Harold from their 30th anniversary celebration, alongside a newer picture of her and Brian taken at Thanksgiving. "I found the old photo when I was clearing out the house," Brian explained. "I thought it belonged here in your new home." Margaret touched the images gently. "It's perfect. Thank you. I'm sorry for all the birthdays I missed," Brian said quietly, "and for all the times I didn't listen or see what was happening." "We're past that now," Margaret assured him. "Besides, I've learned that self-respect is worth more than approval, even from family. Sometimes you have to forget who you're supposed to be to remember who you are." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the waves. Inside, friends were beginning to arrive for her 65th birthday celebration, a gathering that would include her new neighbors, Thomas's family, and even Detective Morris, who had become a friend through the ordeal. Margaret Thompson, once forgotten, was now firmly at the center of a life she had chosen for herself. As she led her son inside to join the growing party, she felt a sense of completeness that had nothing to do with her inherited millions and everything to do with reclaiming her dignity and her voice. "Before we join everyone," Brian said, pausing at the door, "I wanted to ask you something. Would you consider letting me come work for your new foundation? I know I have a lot to learn, but I want to help other families avoid what happened to us." Margaret smiled, touched by his request. The Margaret Thompson Foundation for Financial Literacy and Fraud Prevention had been her way of transforming her painful experience into something positive. "I'd like that very much," she said. "We make a good team." As they entered the warmth of the house filled with laughter and conversation, Margaret felt a profound gratitude for her journey, difficult as it had been. The forgotten birthdays had led to the greatest gift of all, the courage to rewrite her own story. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and redemption, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring more powerful stories like Margaret's to light. Thank you for listening.